Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Environmentally Harmful Dumping of Inefficient and Obsolete Air Conditioners in Africa webinar. My name is Rebecca Schloman, and I am a Senior Associate CLASP, and I'm pleased that all of you could join us today. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to go through the agenda. So today we will begin with an introduction to the webinar from Gabrielle Dreyfus, a senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. This will be approximately 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will begin with the presentation of the report findings. I will be presenting that for approximately 30 minutes. After this, we will have a Q&A session in which we will invite all of you to submit your questions. So that everyone is aware, the webinar is being recorded, and following the event, we will share an email with a link to the recording in case you would like to share it with any of your colleagues. Also, to submit questions during the presentations or at the end of the presentations during the Q&A, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can see an image of it here. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Gabrielle Dreyfus. She is a senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. She is a climate scientist, She's a climate scientist by training with over a decade of experience working on climate and energy policy with the US government and civil society. She advises the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, is a member of the Global Cooling Prize Technical Review Committee, and a member of the Energy Efficiency Task Force of the Montreal Protocol Technology and Economic Assessment Panel. Gabby?
Thank you, Rebecca. So I don't know if my video works. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like my video isn't working, but hopefully you can all hear me. I thank you for that introduction, and I want to welcome everyone for joining. This is the CLASP and IGSD launch of this report on environmentally harmful dumping, inefficient and obsolete air conditioners in Africa. This report is timely. The pandemic and economic downturn is a reminder that energy efficiency is essential to community and citizen health, productivity, and financial security. Unfortunately, inefficient and obsolete air conditioners divert energy for more productive uses and at the same time degrade the environment. So while air conditioners are important for human health and productivity, it's important that the best of these technologies are available and accessible so that they can provide those benefits while minimizing the environmental pollution that they cause. And as we'll see in the report, I just want to provide up front some context for that. So air conditioners cause environmental pollution in two primary ways. The first is through direct emissions of the refrigerant due, for example, to leakage, or if it's not recovered at the end of the life, leakage at the end of life. Obsolete refrigerants like HCFC 22 are both ozone depleting and powerful greenhouse gases. There's the newer HFC blend 410A isn't ozone depleting, but is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's about 2,000 times more potent than CO2. And together, these types of super polluting greenhouse gases, in particular the HFCs that are strongly warming, are being phased down under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And HCFC 22 is already being phased down through previous requirements on the Montreal Protocol. The second way that air conditioners degrade the environment is through the emissions associated with generating the electricity to power the ACs. And these indirect emissions can account for 80% of the warming emissions from air conditioners over their lifetimes. And this is one of the reasons why energy efficiency is so important. So together, the ozone depletion, the warming associated with both the direct and indirect emissions, and of other pollutants that are associated with generating electricity, for example, are really significant contributors to air pollution that have health, agricultural, ecological, and cultural impacts. This report is really important in that it explores the market conditions that can facilitate the sales of air conditioners and components that are in many cases too inefficient or obsolete to be allowed for sale in their countries of manufacture. As you'll see, about a quarter of the inefficient ACs are imported to Africa, with the remaining 3/4 of inefficient ACs assembled in Africa. It's important to note as part of this that the key component that limits the efficiency and the refrigerant that the air conditioner works on is the compressor. There was a report in 2019 by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that mapped global compressor production. And to my knowledge, and from that report, all of the AC compressors are imported into Africa. So this report is really important and compiles data from multiple sources to support its main finding, which is that environmentally harmful dumping is occurring in Africa. In some cases, this involves illegal trade, as in the continuing cross-border shipments to Ghana of used refrigeration and air conditioning appliances, despite the ban on imports of such products. In most cases, the absence of strong energy efficiency and refrigerant transition policies helps enable this environmental dumping. And so with that, I want to turn it back to Rebecca, who will present us with the key findings of the report. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Gabby. So I will now begin with a presentation on the findings of the report. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Rebecca Schloman, and I'm a senior associate at CLASP, where I work primarily on cooling, the efficiency of cooling appliances, mainly air conditioners. So as Gabby mentioned, the demand for space cooling is growing globally and especially in Africa. And while growth of the market may not be as fast in Africa as it is in some other developing markets, we believe that as incomes and temperatures rise, we will see demand continuing to grow for air conditioners. Currently, weak or non-existent minimum energy performance standards, which I will refer to as MEPS, and a lack of proactive and anti-environmental dumping policies in many African countries have facilitated environmentally harmful dumping of inefficient, high global warming potential air conditioner products into African markets. CLASP and IGSD wanted to understand the extent and impact of environmental dumping of room ACs into the African markets. Thus, we designed this study. So first, I'd like to discuss what we mean by environmental dumping. We used a definition that was established by IGSD in a paper that came out in 2018. When we talk about environmental dumping, we are not talking about exclusively dumping of secondhand or used products that cannot be refurbished for reuse. This type of dumping does occur, but our definition is a bit broader and includes new products that can be environmentally harmful due to their use of obsolete technologies, like the refrigerants that Gabby mentioned earlier. In the case of room AC equipment, environmental dumping can include the export of technology that cannot legally be sold in the country of export. This is as a consequence of that technology's failure to meet environmental, safety, energy efficiency, or other product standards in that country of export. Another form of environmental dumping in the case of room ACs can be the export of technology that is unusable in the country of export because the refrigerants used in that technology are no longer available due to national regulation or phase out / phase down schedules. So the scope of this study, which is a study in Africa, we looked at 4 regions and specifically at 10 countries. To combine, the 10 countries we looked at represent more than 90% of the African room AC market. So we looked at Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia in North Africa. We looked at Ghana and Nigeria in West Africa. In East Africa, we looked at Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. And for Southern Africa, we looked at South Africa. As well, for the product scope of this study, we looked only at split type room air conditioners. This is because this is the most common type of air conditioner found in Africa. So I'd like to briefly take all of you through our approach and some of the data sources that we used so that you can understand where our research is coming from. So the approach we had in this study was to look at we started with data collection and desk research, and our aim was to analyze the market size and composition of these AC markets in the 10 countries, as well as to analyze trade flows, both from an intra-regional perspective, as well as looking at trade flows from outside of Africa into Africa. We also conducted interviews with policymakers and industry in 4 of the countries in the study: Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. These interviews served as a way to both check some of the data we'd collected and our desk research, as well as to provide anecdotal insights that could help us understand the situation in a lot of these markets. Finally, using all of the data that we had collected, we conducted a modeling effort where we modeled the stock of air conditioners in use in the 4 regions we looked at. And we looked at the energy consumption from air conditioner usage, as well as the associated emissions. As Gabby mentioned, that's both indirect emissions as well as direct emissions. And we examined this, we modeled this under multiple policy scenarios, which I will go into a bit later in the presentation. With respect to the data sources that we used, our main source of data was sales-weighted model-level information for new room air conditioners, as collected by the Building Services Research and Information Association, or BSRIA. To cross-check the BSRIA data and to supplement any data gaps for our modeling, we relied on market data from Euromonitor, the Japan Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Industry Association, as well as our own 2018 to 2019 market research in Kenya. This data was helpful in cross-checking the type of information we were getting on market size and composition, as well as in filling in some of the gaps for our modeling effort. As well, when we looked at trade data, we again used our primary data from BSRIA, as well as cross-checked that data with import and export information we were able to attain from the UN Comtrade database, which relies on HS codes to track room air conditioners. And if you have any questions, or if you're curious to learn more about our methodology, I would refer you to the full report. So I'd now like to move into the meat of this study, which is the evidence base for whether or not environmental dumping is occurring. So we'll start off by discussing the market size for room air conditioners. Euromonitor provides estimated market sizes for new room air conditioners. So in 2018, Euromonitor estimated that approximately 2.8 million new room air conditioners were sold in Africa. When we compared this to our model level data from BSRIA, we found that the BSRIA data set covered approximately 1.7 million units, which is about 60% of the estimated full size of the market for room air conditioners in Africa. So what we're looking at with the information I'll next be presenting is a picture of about 60% of the market. And I will mention that because we relied on market research data, we were only able to really look in detail at the market for new room ACs. In many countries, there is a large market for used ACs. However, there is very little tracking of the used market. For instance, the HS code used for tracking imports and exports of split ACs does not differentiate between used and new, which means most countries do not have accurate reported information on the size of their used markets. However, some anecdotal information is available. For instance, we spoke with policymakers in Tunisia, and one of them estimated the used market is close to the same size as the new market, which means that what we're presenting to you and the impacts that we will be presenting to you are actually probably larger than what we were able to model due to the lack of information on the used market. If you look at the figure on the right, this can give you just a brief picture or an overview of the brands that are available in Africa. Through this study, we found over 40 air conditioner brands that were selling in these 10 markets. So I'd now like to discuss the market characteristics with respect to compressor type. This is that technology that Gabby mentioned that is the limiting factor in efficiency in a lot of cases. I will also discuss refrigerant type. So when we look at compressor type, we see that the market for room ACs is still very much dominated by fixed speed units. And there's some inverter units, especially when you look at South Africa. There's a lot of inverter units in South Africa, but in general, Most of them are fixed speed units. For some of the data in our data set, compressor type was not available. These are indicated in gray. Based on looking at the efficiency levels and refrigerant types of the units for which the compressor type was unidentified, we suspect that most of them are fixed speed units. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, you'll see the refrigerant distribution for ACs in Africa. You can see that R22 and R410A still make up the majority of the market, and R32, which is a lower GWP refrigerant blend, was only found in South Africa. We have some anecdotal information that R32 is probably found here and there in some of these other countries, but it really hasn't gotten a strong market penetration yet. And as Gabby mentioned in her introductory remarks, R22 and R410A are both refrigerants with high global warming potential. So seeing that R32 and other refrigerant blends are not yet penetrating the market is a point of concern. So I've discussed compressor types and refrigerant types, and now I'd like to discuss the efficiency levels we observe in Africa. The most commonly used energy performance metric in Africa is the energy efficiency ratio, or EER. In the few instances where fixed speed models reported efficiency using SEER, CLASP converted this to EER. So there are other efficiency metrics, SEER, SEER, and CSPF, which are being adopted around the world because they can more accurately represent the efficiency benefits of inverter ACs. However, what we see in Africa is that they're still mostly using EER, which is why we conducted our study using EER. Now, if you look at the efficiency levels of ACs sold in the 10 countries, we can see that there is a large range of efficiency levels, the lowest being 2.4 watts per watt and the highest being 5.5 watts per watt. However, if you look at the X's in this figure, you'll see that the average efficiency level is considerably lower. And we calculated the sales weighted average efficiency level, and it was 3.04 watts per watt across the 10 markets. So despite the large range of efficiency levels on the market, we're still seeing a relatively low average. And if we're talking about the majority of ACs, you can look at this dark blue 75th percentile dot on the chart, and you can see that the majority of ACs still fall below 3.21 watts per watt when sales weighted across these markets. So CLASP, for the purposes of this study, defined low efficiency for an AC as an energy efficiency ratio of less than 3 watts per watt. We chose this threshold because this level is below the minimum energy performance standards for most non-African countries that export either parts for assembly, such as compressors, or fully assembled room ACs into Africa. For example, China, South Korea, Japan, and the US. Thus, this 3.0 watts per watt is a useful benchmark for us to identify potential dumping of inefficient ACs and the components for inefficient ACs. So when we look at the market, low efficiency room ACs, being ACs with an EER of less than 3.0 watts per watt, make up 35% of new room AC sales in the 10 focus countries. The market size for these low efficiency units was approximately 650,000 units in 2018. And at least 78% of these lower efficiency units use R22 refrigerant, and at least 15% use R410A. The remaining units did not, their refrigerant type was not available, but we suspect based on the efficiency levels that they probably use either R22 or R410A. As you can see from the figure on the left, the largest markets for these low efficiency room ACs are Nigeria and Egypt, followed by Ghana and Algeria. Some markets lean heavily towards imports, such as Ghana, Tanzania, while some other markets actually lean more towards locally assembled products, and that's what we see in Nigeria, Egypt, and Algeria. So digging in a bit more into what the sources are for these low efficiency ACs, we see that of the 650,000 low efficiency units sold in Africa in 2018, 26% were imported from outside of Africa, while the remaining 74% of low efficiency products were assembled in Africa. We looked at the brands of all of these lower efficiency products and separated the ones assembled in Africa into 3 different subcategories based on what type of company was producing them. So the 3 types of companies producing ACs in Africa are local subsidiaries of non-African companies. This is what you can see in brown. So 6% of the units in our data set were produced by these local subsidiaries. The second type of company assembling in Africa is a joint venture, but are joint ventures between African companies and non-African companies. And the third type of company assembling in Africa are wholly African-owned African companies that use parts imported from abroad to assemble the ACs. And as you can see from the chart, there was a portion of the market for which we did not have brand level information, so we were not able to identify whether or not those units were produced by local subsidiaries, joint ventures, or wholly African companies. Now, if we take an even closer look at the state of the imported low efficiency room ACs, we see that the primary source of new low efficiency room ACs are China, South Korea, the US, and Japan. The specific source country was not indicated for approximately 10%. However, we were able to determine that they were imported based on looking at the brands and recognizing that they're not brands that produce in Africa. And of the imported low efficiency units, just looking at that share of the market, approximately 23% of the imports are Chinese, 26% come from South Korea, 3.2% come from the US, and around 8% come from Japan, and the others are a smaller, less than 1% market share for imported units. Now, if we look at the other side of this figure, at those products that are assembled in Africa, we see that the majority of products are produced by African companies and the aforementioned joint venture operations, which are a collaboration between an African company and one or more non-African companies. Most of the locally assembled products are produced in Nigeria, Egypt, and Algeria. While Nigeria and Egypt export some of the locally assembled ACs to other countries, Algerian ACs are produced primarily for their domestic market. The local industries in Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria are quite robust, and this is because they are supported by specific trade and tax measures. For instance, in Egypt, there is a 60% import tariff for room air conditioners originating from countries outside of the Gulf Cooperation Council. This encourages local production in Egypt. In Nigeria, also one of the larger producers of air conditioner units in Africa, local import duties are lower for completely knocked down units than they are compared to the fully assembled units when imported. So this encourages the import of knockdown units for assembly in Nigeria. And then in Algeria, what we see is that since 2018, Algeria has outright banned importation of fully assembled room air conditioners. In 2016, they introduced a tax incentive for high efficiency appliances, including air conditioners, imported to or manufactured in Algeria. However, the tax incentive has not yet been implemented due to challenges in identifying the organization that would classify and verify products based on their energy efficiency. Thus, we would consider Algeria is kind of considering this preferential tax incentive, but right now they're still operating with really just this full ban on imported room ACs, which is why we see them producing a large share for their domestic market. So we also, in addition to examining ACs based on their efficiency level, we also looked at our data based off of the refrigerant type. So when we looked by refrigerant type, and specifically when we looked at R22, because R22 is scheduled to be phased out globally, we saw that R22 room air room air conditioners made up 47% of new sales in the 10 focus countries. So the market size for R22 units was approximately 800,000 units. This includes most of the low efficiency units I was discussing earlier, but also there are some of these R22 units are above that 3.0 watt per watt cutoff I mentioned. The highest efficiency level we saw for an R22 unit was an EER of 3.48 watts per watt, but the average efficiency level is much lower, around an EER of 2.9 watts per watt. And this is consistent with what we generally see of units using R22 and often units using R410A as well, being slightly on lower efficiency compared to units that use other refrigerants like R32. So what I want to show you here with this figure is a comparison of the imported and locally assembled R22 room air conditioners, what you can see with the orange and purple dots, against the MEPS that we currently see in Africa. So you can see the MEPS for Kenya, Egypt, South Africa, Tunisia, and Ghana, as well as for Nigeria and Morocco. And what you can see is that a lot of the units are below these MEPS. So what the units that are below that lowest MEPS level for Nigeria and Morocco are the units that are probably being sold in the countries that don't currently have MEPS. Out of the 10 countries we looked at, only 7 have MEPS. So this image is just to give you a picture of what the market looks like, and to understand that there are a lot of low efficiency units on the market, and that the MEPS levels really don't seem to be really restricting the flow of low efficiency units as well as we would like to see. So I hope that what you can take from the previous section is that there is evidence for environmental dumping of inefficient ACs using obsolete refrigerant technologies like R22 and R410A. And now I would like to discuss the policy landscape in Africa and how that contributes to the environmental dumping challenge. So CLASP looked at the minimum energy performance standards as well as labeling policies in these 10 countries. 7 out of the 10 countries currently have minimum energy performance standards for room ACs, and all 10 countries have some form of mandatory or voluntary energy labeling for air conditioners. As you saw previously, the MEPS all range from between an EER of 2.8 watts per watt to an EER of 3.1 watts per watt. And higher MEPS that are more on par with those in the major AC and AC component exporting countries would help to prevent dumping, as Gabby mentioned in her opening remarks. So what we're really looking to see when we look at MEPS and labeling is we're looking to understand what are the levels that are being used to regulate efficiency in these markets, and which countries are missing MEPS, because having MEPS that are consistent regionally can also be very helpful in preventing dumping. So in addition to looking at the energy, the energy efficiency policies in these 10 countries, we also looked at policy regulating ozone depleting substances. Now, Gabby gave a great introduction to the Montreal Protocol and to the Kigali Amendment and what we're trying to accomplish with both of these international agreements. And currently, all 10 countries have either ratified or acceded to the Montreal Protocol. And at least 8 have passed other regulations which limit the manufacture, sale, or use of ozone depleting substances. Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa have ratified or acceded to, have ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol as of this past month. But what we're seeing is that 3 countries still have yet to ratify the Kigali Amendment, and the ratification process is currently ongoing in 3 of the other countries. So one of the challenges, or not one, but some of the challenges faced in implementing ozone depleting substances, ozone depleting substance regulations include lack of awareness among stakeholders, illegal shipment of restricted refrigerants. Another challenge is inadequate resources for enforcement personnel. There's a lack of adequate financial and technical resources for local manufacturers to transition away from R22 refrigerant. This is important because, as we've seen, there is a lot of local production of room air conditioners, and most of these manufacturers will need some level of assistance to transition to producing air conditioners that use newer refrigerant blends like R32. Some other challenges are limited institutional capacity and lack of dedicated HS codes for different HFCs. The HS codes are the internationally used codes for tracking imports and exports of different products, including refrigerants. And while R22 has a dedicated HS code, there aren't individual HS codes for R410A or R32 yet. So this makes it difficult to really track the refrigerants that are coming into the country and recognize these overarching trends. This situation will hopefully be resolved soon with revisions to the HS codes. So beyond policy for ODS, we also looked at policy for regulating hazardous waste. So the Basel Convention is an international treaty that seeks to reduce hazardous waste generation and to restrict the movements of hazardous waste between countries. To date, efforts under the Basel Convention have focused around environmentally sound management, preventing illegal imports to developing countries, and capacity building. One of the things we were looking at with the Basel Convention was trying to understand whether or not the Basel Convention could be used to effectively regulate trade in secondhand equipment. And one of the challenges is that secondhand equipment that is tagged or flagged as being destined for reuse often falls outside of the scope of the Basel Convention. Another hazardous waste policy we looked at is the Bamako Convention, which is a regional treaty among African nations which aims to ban the import of hazardous waste into the continent. The treaty addresses a weakness of the Basel Convention, which still permits the transboundary movement of hazardous waste for recycling and recovery. The Bamako Convention will prohibit the import of all hazardous and radioactive waste into Africa for any reason, and will try to minimize and control the movement of such waste within the region. Currently, the Bamako Convention has been ratified by 4 of the countries we looked at and remains to be ratified by the other 6. Some other challenges that we have seen with respect to regulating hazardous waste is that, again, there are very few statistics on import and export of used electronic equipment, including ACs, and this lack of information on the scale of the used or secondhand product market makes it very challenging to regulate. So, mentioning secondhand, we also tried to look at what policies exist for regulating secondhand equipment. As I previously mentioned, secondhand or used appliances flagged for reuse are generally imported from larger appliance markets outside of Africa, or they might be generated internally from households or businesses replacing old appliances. While some countries in Africa have implemented specific regulation to control secondhand product markets, others have not. What you can see here in the table are that Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria have all implemented some sort of policy or are in the process of implementing a policy to try and restrict the movement of these secondhand products. And some of the challenges, in addition to the lack of data for controlling secondhand products, are the political implications of an outright ban on secondhand products, limited resources of border control agencies, and the porous borders that we observe in Africa, which means that the porous borders essentially mean that a regional approach will really be necessary to fully tackle this secondhand product market, because a lot of the products are not coming in through ports where you might have a customs official who can really easily check them. I do want to make mention of at least one successful case of secondhand product regulation, and that case is Ghana's used equipment ban, which began being enforced in 2013. This ban has been very successful in restricting the import of used equipment because used equipment often lacks the quality controls in place for new equipment. That's why it needs more regulation. So since the ban, which is for this Ghana's used equipment ban covers refrigerators and air conditioners, secondhand refrigerators and secondhand ACs. Since the ban came into effect, the government of Ghana has seized almost 40,000 secondhand refrigerators and almost 10,000 secondhand ACs. And based off of the seizure of these products, the Ghana Energy Commission estimates that banning secondhand ACs and refrigerators has resulted in energy savings of almost 3,600 gigawatt hours. So what we're seeing here with Ghana's used equipment ban is that having a used equipment ban can be very effective in restricting the trade in products that we don't really know how efficiently they really operate, or if they're even capable of being refurbished for reuse. As you can see in the photo on the left, some of the equipment that comes into Africa that is designated as a used product is really equipment that is beyond it's beyond the end of its lifetime and is not in a state where it can be refurbished for reuse. So those are some of the challenges that we're faced, some of the policies that can help us tackle the dumping challenge. Now I'd like to move into discussing the modeling that we did. So CLASP conducted modeling to estimate the environmental impact of dumping and thereby the greenhouse gas emissions that could be avoided with ambitious anti-dumping policies. So CLASP looked at the United for Efficiency U4E model MEPS to help us in our modeling. In September of last year, United for Efficiency published model energy performance standards and labeling guidance to assist governments in developing and emerging economies. Essentially, these guidelines can assist these governments in developing MEPS and labeling programs that suit their climatic conditions, the climatic conditions in their country. So for modeling the impact of ambitious energy efficiency policy, CLASP examined the range of recommended MEPS by U4E for countries in Africa. So you can see from this table, we looked at the minimum MEPS that were recommended for countries in Africa, and we looked at the maximum MEPS, and we decided to go with somewhere with the group 3 MEPS from U4E's model regulations, because these fall roughly in the middle of the range of MEPS that could be applied in Africa based on U4E recommendations. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Africa still primarily uses EER as the energy efficiency metric for room air conditioners, we had to convert the U4E recommended MEPS, which use CSPF, to EER, and we did that using the in accordance with ISO testing standards. And if you want more information, it is in the full report. To get an idea of what these MEPS levels, these U4E MEPS levels would look like against the current market, you can take a look at this figure. This figure shows the full air conditioner market in Africa mapped against the current African MEPS that you saw previously, as well as against the U4E model MEPS. We've also included the Chinese MEPS prior to 2020. China's in the process of raising the MEPS. Their MEPS, the first phase, I believe, goes into effect this month in July. And in 2022, the Chinese MEPS will be roughly around the same level as the U4E MEPS. I mentioned China here because one of our recommendations to policymakers is that they align their MEPS, the MEPS for their country, with the MEPS in place in major AC manufacturing countries. And China is an example of that. And once the new Chinese MEPS come into play, they will be on the high end for the market. And so I think what I want you to see in this figure is by looking at that solid blue line for the U4E model MEPS we used in our modeling, you can see that this is an ambitious target. A lot of the air conditioners on the African market do not currently meet that level. However, as I've mentioned, the African market currently has a lot of low efficiency units, and this is in comparison to what we see in other markets around the world. So we believe that this U4E model MEPS is an ambitious but achievable target. So in addition to looking at the U4E model MEPS to help us model energy efficiency levels, we also looked at U4E's refrigerant guidance. So the U4E model regulations recommend that refrigerants in air conditioners be regulated to limit global warming potential and ozone depletion potential. Specifically, U4E's recommended upper limits for ODP is 0, and for GWP, or global warming potential, the upper limit is 750. As was mentioned in the opening remarks, both R22 and R410A are high global warming potential refrigerants, and some other refrigerants that we see for room air conditioners are R32 and R290, and both of these are below that 750 upper limit recommended by U4E. So for our modeling, we wanted to get a range of what the potential savings could be from refrigerant policy scenarios. So we used 2 scenarios. One is an all R32 scenario, and one is an all R290 scenario, which is essentially assuming that in a given year, all of the ACs on the market will have to have global warming potential of 675 or a global warming potential of less than 1. These 2 scenarios help us to understand what the range of savings for direct emissions could be. So just briefly overviewing what our the scenarios we modeled were. We modeled 4 scenarios. The first is a baseline. This base case scenario assumes that room air conditioner markets in the 4 regions our study covers continued to grow at a constant compound annual growth rate through 2030. And the second qualification for the base case scenario is that the market share of refrigerants gradually changes in accordance with Montreal Protocol phase out and phase down schedules for R22 and R410A. So we modeled 4 regions, and each region has a different constant annual growth rate, and each region had a slightly different share of R22, R410A, and R32. So if you're interested in seeing our assumptions in more detail, take a look at the full report where this modeling is explained in detail. The first scenario we looked at essentially assumes all of the same points as the base case, as well as assuming that in 2022, the U4E model MEPS are adopted across the board. The second scenario we looked at is what we called the U4E model MEPS plus refrigerant regulation scenario, which assumes that the model MEPS are adopted in 2022 and that a policy requiring the use of refrigerants with global warming potential of less than 750 is adopted in 2022. The third scenario we looked at is U4E model MEPS plus best available technology refrigerant regulation, which assumes U4E model MEPS and the use of refrigerants with a global warming potential of less than 150. So this is that all R290 scenario we modeled. Based off of these assumptions and our modeling, we found that adopting MEPS equivalent to the U4E model MEPS would reduce indirect 2030 greenhouse gas emissions from new room air conditioners by approximately 40 megatons of CO2. And as well, additional refrigerant policy could reduce 2030 emissions by a further 10 to 15 megatons of CO2. Thus, combined, the policy options we modeled could reduce 2030 greenhouse gas emissions by somewhere between 14 to 20% relative to the baseline. What this shows us is that energy efficiency policy and refrigerant policy can really contribute to meeting emissions reduction targets in a lot of these countries. And again, and this is something I mentioned early on when I discussed the difficulty we had in identifying market sizes of used air conditioners or the efficiency levels of used air conditioners. What we modeled is only the impact of policy on the new room air conditioner market. And having more robust energy efficiency policies as well as other policies to inhibit dumping would help to increase the savings we could see. Now I'd like to just briefly go through our recommendations to policymakers. So we came to 9 recommendations at the end of our research. The first is, of course, to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol and adopt implementing policies. The second recommendation was to design and implement MEPS and labeling policies consistent with major countries of export. I mentioned this earlier. Our third recommendation was to strengthen institutional arrangements. Specifically, this means we want policymakers to look at mechanisms to encourage different agencies to cooperate on implementing and enforcing MEPS and labeling policies. MEPS and labeling policies cannot be effective without robust enforcement, which includes market surveillance and other compliance activities. Our fourth recommendation is to revise tariffs and other trade policies on RACs to ensure compatibility with energy efficiency goals. Some African countries have tariffs and import bans that promote local assembly and limit access to high efficiency equipment on the international supply chain. Thus, we want to make sure that trade policy is compatible and aligns with energy efficiency targets and doesn't contradict them. Our fifth recommendation was to ban the import of secondhand, including refurbished and inefficient room air conditioners, and to widely publicize and enforce that ban. We saw a ban in practice in Ghana, and they can be very effective tools. Our sixth recommendation is to organize bulk purchase and buyers clubs. These types of programs reduce the cost of high efficiency equipment by organizing large scale buys. We've included in our report a case study of this type of project in Morocco. So I would refer you to the full report if you'd like to learn more about that example. Our seventh recommendation is to properly recycle and dispose of obsolete room air conditioners. In our modeling, we assumed that all air conditioners the refrigerants are not disposed of properly and thus leak into the atmosphere. So one of the important things that needs to happen in Africa and in other countries, and in all around the world, other continents, other countries, is that we need to see proper recycling and disposal of obsolete room ACs so that those refrigerants do not leak. Our eighth recommendation is to elevate solutions to the regional level. As we've seen, a lot of countries have challenges with porous borders, and MEPS levels can vary between countries. Approaching regulating energy efficiency of ACs from a regional basis can be very helpful. Our last recommendation is to make sure that as you're going through these other recommendations, that policymakers are engaging the local groups that profit under the current system. That means engaging with industry and making sure that industry is still able to operate and produce equipment, but assisting industry in moving towards producing higher efficiency equipment. Lastly, I'd just like to mention that our study doesn't cover everything, and over the course of this research, we identified some areas where we would like to do further research. And for the sake of time, I will let you read this slide, and we'll share it later. And as well, I'd refer you to the full report. But there's a lot of need for additional research in this field to really understand and tackle the environmental dumping issue. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I would now invite you to submit any questions you have via the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar screen. We are running a little bit behind, but I think we can stay on a few minutes longer to answer your questions. Okay. So Gabby, I have a question that I'd like to direct to you, since you've worked on refrigerants a bit more than I have. We have one attendee asking about the flammability issue of low GWP refrigerants and whether or not our third scenario is really practical.
So there have been a number of demonstration and other projects that with R290 using equipment. I think there are thousands of units that are currently in operation in India and China. And I believe there's a project currently going on in Ghana and some of the Caribbean states. And so from a technical perspective, these units are very well proven. And for R32, there are now millions of units that are operating around the world. One of the really important aspects to keep in mind, though, is that this introduction went hand in hand with skills and training and building safety standards. So it's very important that there be properly trained technicians who do the installation and maintenance of these units.
Thank you, Gabby. So I have another question that I will endeavor to answer, and Gabby or Tad can jump in if they have something to add. So we received a question that is, why are new ACs based on HCFC 22 considered dumping? And though HCFC 22 is being phased out and developing countries still have time to implement that, we have to remind ourselves that HCFC 22 is not a banned substance unless the government does so in those developing countries. And yes, that is true. HCFC 22 is not a banned substance in a lot of these countries. We've considered this to be dumping because, firstly, we've defined dumping to also include inefficient technologies. And what we're seeing is that most of the units that contain HCFC 22 are lower efficiency units, which means that even if there was no leakage of refrigerant through the lifetime of the AC is still consuming a lot of electricity that is associated with emissions at the point of generation. Additionally, when we think of dumping, we think of essentially transferring a product that has a negative environmental impact to other countries. So if some of the other countries around the world who are exporting ACs that use R22 or are exporting the components for ACs that use R22, if those countries are phasing out R22, why are they still producing equipment for R22 ACs, and why are they still exporting R22 ACs to other countries? Essentially, that is dumping because the countries that are exporting are, they don't want the technology in their own country. They've banned it in their own country, but they're willing to export it to another country. And that's why we define it as dumping.
Hi, this is Tad Ferris.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Rebecca? I'll just add on so that Alvin has a little context for this. Alvin, if you look at the original paper where we defined, I was one of the lead authors on that Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum paper from 2018. You'll note, one, that activity that is legal in the country of import of the R22, for instance, can be considered within the definition we proposed of environmental dumping, while the importing government authorities consider new policies, regulations, and or legislation. So it's a phenomenon that Rebecca laid out, but it does encompass a broader activity than simply what is currently legal in the country of import versus legal in the country of export. And we're providing these options as tools for countries to consider. One means they can use to intervene if they wish, and also means and options to acquire the benefits of stemming environmental dumping where they believe that is contrary to national interests, and also their ability to comply with global environmental agreements.
Thank you, Tad. So we have another question. Is there any evidence to suggest that equipment that is compliant with MEPS in other major economies is unaffordable to the target markets in Africa? And sorry, part of the, there we go. Also, i.e., is there any economic justification from the user's perspective for this poor equipment? So one thing I will point to, so we were not able to get prices at the retail side for all of this equipment. We did have the manufacturer's prices. And what we see when we look at Africa as compared to some of the other countries I've had the opportunity to look at, so we've looked at these 10 African countries. I've also personally worked on Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines to some extent. And what we see is that there are, the equipment that is coming into Africa is probably a little overpriced for what it is based on efficiency levels. What we see in Southeast Asia, for example, which is also a developing market for room air conditioners, is that there is some room for these air conditioners to be more efficient and still be affordable. I think this is one region where more research could help to prove the point a bit better. And I think some of that research would need to look at the prices of products that are available in Africa, and that would involve actually going to retail stores and looking at the prices. One of the reasons we did not do that is, as we've seen in another study we did for Kenya, a lot of times the prices are negotiated, which means that the price you see in a store is not necessarily the price it's going to sell for. This makes it more difficult to collect that type of price information. But yes, some of the equipment, the really higher efficiency units, are still going to be expensive for the average African consumer. But there's room to get above the levels we're seeing now of having 35% of units on the market below 3.0 watts per watt. I don't know, Gabby, if you want to say anything further on this, just in terms of the opportunity for African consumers to really use this equipment, purchase it.
Yeah, so I would lean in on the difference between cost to manufacture and get to market versus price. So one of the things that I think there is anecdotal evidence for is that when you have markets that are flooded with some of these lower efficiency equipment that are often using obsolete components, I will say, so one of the things that we know is that because R22 has been on the phase, is excuse me, scheduled to be phased out for over a decade, there has been little to no innovation on the technologies that use R22. So there are no inverter R22 compressors, for example. So it's one of the reasons we call these obsolete, even if it's still legal for sale. And so one of the questions we get a lot is, why don't I have access to the new technologies in my country? And part of it is, if you're flooded with this obsolete, inefficient equipment, then the price dynamic, it might be that there's a small increment of cost to produce the newer technologies, but really what we see in the markets all the time is that the pricing does not reflect the cost of manufacture in many ways. And so, yes, in general, these newer technologies can cost more to produce, but there is the presence of these obsolete technologies is going to, I think it's overstating it to say that these are cost prohibitive. We know, especially in China, where 50 million of these are sold a year, 100 million units plus produced a year, these are commodity products. And so I think that it is, there's very little evidence to suggest that lack of access to the newer technologies is due to cost issues.
Rebecca, if I may, can I add a little bit on the price question as well?
Please do.
So, thanks. And as Rebecca discussed as well, there are some trade policies, particularly in Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria, that are affecting the final price of the products because the way the import tariff or duties are defined. Just to remember everyone, we reviewed that Egypt imposes a 60% import tariff on products that are coming outside the Gulf Cooperation Council. So that effectively is increasing the price of high efficient equipment that is coming outside that association. And Nigeria as well has higher import duties for products that are fully assembled. So that has an effect as well on the high efficiency units, and similarly to Algeria, that has a ban on products that are fully assembled and can only allow products that are locally assembled. So there's also the component of trade policy affecting the affordability of the high efficiency equipment that is coming into African markets.
So as we're a little past the time, Rebecca, Claudia, I see that we were not going to be able to answer all of these questions that are open. They are being collected, and I believe we will be following up afterwards. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. Any questions we don't get to, we can follow up afterwards. Do we want to
keep the good questions coming?
Yeah. Do we want to take a few more, Gabby? Do you and Tad have time?
Yes, I think a few minutes. Yep.
Okay. So we received a question that I thought you might be able to speak to a bit, Gabby, about what are the options that some of these countries may have for properly recycling and disposing of obsolete room ACs and obsolete refrigerants.
Yeah, so this is one of these interventions that is best to do at larger scale and through aggregation. The types of programs and projects that I'm aware of that have done this, doing it one-off is, I think there's a high transaction cost. So the first is, of course, to identify facilities and people who have the skills to do this. There's been, in terms of recapture and recycling or destruction of the refrigerant, for example, the Montreal Protocol's technical and economic assessment panel has evaluated a number of different technologies. One that is widely available and that is approved for some of the, or recommended for some of these refrigerants is cement kilns, for example. But I would encourage folks to look at a project that's currently underway in Morocco that's being led by the Bank of Africa, BMC Bank, which is looking at piloting a replacement program that will take out of operation inefficient, obsolete ACs, replace them with high efficiency products, and follow through with the recycling and destruction of the refrigerant. And I believe there's some documents on the IGSD website describing that process. And the benefit, of course, is that there's employment and benefits, and there's also the energy cost savings to the participants.
And Gabby and Rebecca, also IGSD has a Buyers Club a guidebook that is available on our website, and we can share that following the presentation with folks. I noted also that Kofi Agariko asked for examples of countries where the Buyers Club model has worked.
Yeah, we can include that in the email that we use to follow up with this presentation. So maybe we can take one more question, since we have Ana Maria Carreño, one of my colleagues at CLASP, on the line as well. We had a question about whether there are any similar studies for Latin America, given that from the point of view of average EER and existent MEPS, the situation is quite similar to the situation in the African market. Ana, do you know of any similar studies for Latin America that have been conducted?
I'm not aware of general studies at the regional level, similar like the one we just published, and I think it would be great to do a similar effort in Latin America and to find evidence if there is dumping of environmental and harmful products. We have done a study on Brazil specifically on the compressors market and on the effect of local regulations on the availability of efficient products, and I'll be happy to share that with the participant that asked the question, Rebecca. But that's the only one that I'm aware of.
Yep, and also the original dumping paper that we presented has a Brazil case study embedded within it.
Great, thank you. And I think with that, I would just follow up that we had a question about what is the COOL Coalition doing to address this issue. And I just wanted to answer that briefly. Right now, the Cool Coalition has established recently an anti-dumping working group, and we are in the early stages of looking at what the existing literature is on dumping in Africa, and we will be exploring, looking at doing similar research to what's been done for air conditioners as for this study for refrigerators. So the Cool Coalition is trying to take a proactive approach to looking at the dumping issue and identifying potential solutions for Africa, at least. And hopefully those solutions could be expanded to other countries outside of Africa. And with that, I think we're about 10 minutes over. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and for all of your great questions. For those questions that we were not able to get to, we will try to address them and include the answers in our follow-up email, which will also include a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as some of the reports that my colleagues have mentioned during the Q&A. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.